welcome to our second episode of The Final Glass, where we kind of mix crossfire, history, and alcohol, of course. Uh, it's been a week, so
Sure.
you want to...
So we can talk about how we got the name for the show, and it's from the Oscar Wilde quote. So after the first glass, you see things as you wish to see them. After the second glass, you see things as they are not. And after the final glass, you see things as they really are. And that's the most horrible thing in the world.
It is, and we say this every time, but I really am comfortable, and I would prefer to keep my delusions in the long run. So that final glass, I think the moral of that quote is stop drinking before you get to that point.
Yeah, but the irony is, no matter which glass you finish with, that's going to be the final glass.
Oh, that is true. That is true. And I think that before we go a little further, we need to discuss this issue here again, just as a reminder.
So the lights in here are too bright. I had laser eye surgery, and we're having a discussion not growing sunflowers.
Yes, exactly. So before we get into our first glass, let's go ahead and talk about what we're going to be talking about, which is this whole thing that has been going on in the world with airspace intrusions. And Yakov, you actually did some time in the Air Force.
I did.
And so this is something that's super interesting to you, and it's been a huge topic of discussion at our house. So we are going to be discussing airplane shoot downs in history. But first, the alcohol. Would you like to start?
I'll start. So I'm going to have some Paul John whiskey. Now, this is an Indian whiskey, and India has gotten into the whiskey game fairly recently. They got it from the Scottish, and a lot of their master distillers were Scottish to start with. So on the nose, you get a heavy dose of spice, you get a fair amount of smoke, and you get a little bit of bourbon vanilla.
Smells kind of peaty
flavor.
to me.
There's a little bit of peat too. Peat is normally
I smell your whiskey.
yes. Peat is normally a Scottish whiskey.
Well, that would make sense if
Sense.
their master distillers were Scottish.
Correct, but
Yeah.
indeed, their master distillers were Scottish.
So I'm going very basic, and I'm also going with the holiday season. My husband bought me this Bailey's, which is toffee popcorn flavor, and I am currently addicted, which is really kind of actually a bad thing to say about alcohol. But in any case, I will be adding this to my coffee today, a little bit at a time, and it's amazing. It's the whole toffee. Oh, it's anyway. Cheers.
Cheers.
Can I cheers with coffee?
You can.
Okay.
As long as it has alcohol in it.
Oh my goodness. Okay, the first glass. So, then we need to start talking about these shoot downs. So I think let's go back as far as we can. We're not going back to the very beginning of aviation, but right after World War II, which is when the world was completely shifting into different camps. And I'd like to focus on Bulgaria.
And just to clarify, we're going to talk about military shoot downs of civilian aircraft.
Well, some of them are military shoot downs of military aircraft
military
too. So we're
aircraft
doing
too.
both.
Yeah, we're doing both. But not during a wartime.
No,
situation.
none of these. Well, yes, but in no case were both of the countries involved in the shoot down at war.
Yes.
In some cases, there was a war. Anyway, You'll see as we go on. So let's start with Bulgaria. So the first one that we're going to talk about just very briefly actually took place in 1948. So it wasn't too long after the beginning of the Cold War, which really started basically the day after World War II ended, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in 1948, in February of 1948, 2 Turkish fighter jets went zooming over Bulgarian territory. The Bulgarians just assumed they were there for nefarious purposes and shot them down. Now, why does this matter? There's a couple reasons. So the first reason is that it was a very big demonstration of the Truman Doctrine, which kind of ended up ruling the world for about 70 years, right?
Mhm.
The second reason that it was important is because, and this is where my husband can get into this, he knows a lot more than I do. Bulgaria had an interesting position within the Warsaw Pact. It wasn't, I'm going to say occupied. Is that the correct word? Maybe
Yeah.
that's not the correct word. It wasn't occupied by the Soviet Union the way other Eastern Bloc countries are. So there were trainers in Bulgaria. There wasn't KGB yet, was it?
No, it was the end of the MGB days.
Yeah. So, but the
Intelligence
stuff was in Bulgaria, but they didn't have Soviet military stationed there. And they also didn't have to take part in a lot of the things that the Soviet Union was doing, extending its reach out. They were, guarding the southern border because by this time Turkey and Greece were well on their way to becoming what would become NATO, even though they weren't yet. So maybe you can explain the Bulgarian.
Sure.
there.
The Bulgarians maintained a small amount of independence, but that's because they were more communist than the communists. And they wanted to show that they are extremely tough. That's why we'll be discussing another Bulgarian shootdown as well. But they wanted to show that they were tough, and the Soviets wanted to demonstrate that it was possible to be independent and still part of the Soviet bloc, which of course we know ended up not being true.
Right.
But early
when push
on,
came to shove.
when push came to shove, but early on, the Bulgarians were a model satellite that wasn't a Soviet satellite.
And I think it's worth pointing out that it was when the Soviets wanted to assassinate people with poison umbrellas, it was Bulgarians that they turned to.
Yeah.
Right? That wasn't, I mean, for all that they had plausible deniability, perhaps, that this was a Bulgarian thing. Yeah, we all know who paid for the bullet,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So this is really the beginning where you see the different satellites, the Soviet satellites and also the Western satellites begin to play out the Truman Doctrine here. And there were spy flights going over Bulgaria. They usually originated out of Greece, however, at that time. So the Turkish planes went down. One pilot survived. He eventually made it back. The next Bulgarian issue we're going to talk about was actually huge, absolutely huge, still talked about today. And that would be El Al Flight 402, which was shot down in 1955 over Bulgaria. It flew London to Vienna, then it was going to Istanbul, and then it was headed to Tel Aviv. And this flight had a problem as surprisingly, this is one thing in our discussions that got me. You almost don't want to fly anymore because you hear about all of these things that can go wrong and that regularly go wrong. And this flight 402 had gone off course. It was supposed to fly over Yugoslavia and then over Greece and ended up flying for like 75 miles through Bulgaria. And the Bulgarians were not happy about that.
When you're flying at high speed, 75 miles isn't very far. But when you're a Bulgarian radar operator sitting on the ground and watching a flight go over your territory, it can be defined as being quite far.
Yeah, and the flight, the aircraft itself had actually previously been used by the Israeli government for military operations. It was then taken out and then used by El Al. So it was no longer being used for that. And it's the shoot down. What got me about this shoot down was that the pilots did say that they had attempted to contact the pilot of the El Al flight. They, however, did not try over the radio. And so I'm curious, why wouldn't they? Why would you not initiate radio contact?
So the Bulgarian Air Force, much like a lot of the Soviet Air Forces, were very heavily dependent on the commands of their superiors. So if their superiors did not explicitly say, contact the flight over the radio the pilots would not have attempted to contact the flight over the radio. They did contact the flight in the form of shooting in front of it.
Yes, which did actually cause the flight to veer off and try to get back into Yugoslav airspace. When it was shot down, it was just a couple miles from the border of both Greece and Yugoslavia. It really wasn't that far inside Bulgarian territory.
Yeah.
So it was shot down by, it was air to air.
It was by MiGs, so it was air to air.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
it's an air to air shoot down.
I'm not good with these terms. So it was an air to air shoot down.
And the pilots claimed that they misidentified the flight because of the darkness. But even in the darkness, an airliner looks quite different than a spy aircraft based on the profile that it's flying, the height that it's flying, the speed that it's flying, the way that it's turning.
This plane had been used.
It had been used, but it didn't look like that. When it was used as a spy plane, it did not look like when it was used as an airliner. For instance, all the windows being open or all the windows being closed, the lights, the running lights, the transmissions from the aircraft would have all been different from a spy flight versus from a passenger flight.
And the pilot of this flight, one of the things I found really interesting, this was actually Winston Churchill's former pilot who was flying this, and he had flown King George as well. So this was not a random, inexperienced pilot who just happened to draw a great flight plan. He knew what he was doing. And it has never actually been conclusively proven why they were off path. And they were off path for quite a while. Mm-hmm. So then the cover-up starts to happen. Because I do love my conspiracy theories. Yes. But I don't think this is really conspiracy theory. This is just pretty much communist business as usual.
It is. The Bulgarians at first tried to deny investigators access to the wreckage, and then afterwards, when they did grant access to the wreckage, it was for a short period of time, only 6 hours, which is not enough to do an investigation of anything.
No, and they had tampered with it as well.
They had tampered with it. They had shot it later. It was a mess. But there's probably an element of incompetence as well as an additional element of a desire to obfuscate what happened.
Yes, and they're just. Here's something though, when big powers are fighting, and this may have been shot down by Bulgaria, but of course the Soviet Union's honor was at stake in this whole issue as well. They can't be seen to be letting their satellites be bullied. So in any case, there really never are. The price that they pay is usually pretty small. Mm-hmm. And they did have to pay the maximum amount in the end of restitution. But it wasn't like, it was just a few $1,000s. It wasn't really that much. And it was less if you were a child, so.
And it was about sending a message.
Which is on both sides.
On both sides, which is don't fly over our airspace.
Yeah, exactly. Which brings us to probably, I would say, the most famous flight shoot down of all time.
That Francis Gary Powers.
Yes. So the 1st of May, 1960, when the American U-2 plane, it's not a jet, right?
It's a plane. Well, it's a jet. It's a plane, yeah. It doesn't have props, so it's a jet.
Okay. Was shot down near Sverdlovsk. Is that how you say
Sverdlovsk.
it? Yeah. And that one is still the shoot down that went around the world. Everybody's still talking about it. And so it originated in Peshawar in Pakistan. And of course, Pakistan then had to apologize for their role in this. And it was supposed to terminate in Norway, which was not supposed to be involved in these kind of things at all. But they were. And so before we get into a lot of the other things, I want to talk about the screw up on the Soviet side when it comes here, because we don't talk about the Soviet screw ups because losing that plane was such a big screw up in itself. So when the plane was shot down, it was shot down by surface to air missiles, correct? So it was shot down, and one of the pursuing interceptors was actually shot down at the same time. And the reason that it was in the wrong place when those missiles went off is because May 1st is a holiday for those in the socialist and communist world.
Mhm.
And people had the day off and they just didn't bother to change the transponders on the MiGs. So they were in the wrong place because they couldn't be told to move.
Yeah. So the transponders were the transponders are the piece of technology in the aircraft that tells the missiles whether this is a friendly or whether it's an enemy aircraft. So it's called squawking a frequency. The frequency the transponder sends out is a frequency that the missile should be able to say, hey, this is our friend, we're not going to go after him. But since the squawk was on the wrong frequency, the missile was unable to do that, so that it hit one of the interceptors.
And it hit 2 planes instead of just 1.
Yeah.
So now, these U-2 flights originally started, they were not flown by American pilots originally. Originally, a part of the plan was that they were supposed to be flown by foreign pilots because, the only country that could have developed them was going to have some kind of deniability that this had nothing to do with them. But at this point, they were using American pilots to fly these U-2 flights, and Francis Gary Powers was, of course, American. He did carry a cyanide capsule, which he didn't use. But I do believe, even though some people are quite nasty about him using it, I think the issue was that he was knocked out when he came out of the plane. He was unable, or something happened so that he was actually unable to get to this pill.
Yeah, he was unable to get to the pill. So the U-2 looks like an airplane and it flies like an airplane, but practically it's a spacecraft. And so it flies right on the outer edge of space. And so the pilots who are in it basically wear a spacesuit. And so it's much more challenging to get out of a spacesuit, and it's much more challenging to do anything inside a spacesuit than it is a regular flight suit. So he can be forgiven for not having a chance to put his pill in.
Well, and who wants to be captured?
Yeah.
By the Soviets as a spy? We all know what happened during the purges in the 1930s. Certainly, you don't want to be the spy captured. So, in any case, the Sovs knew that this flight was coming. They knew that the U.S. was operating under the assumption, they can't see us, we're too high up. Well, the other planes, interceptors, couldn't get to the U-2, but they did know that it was flying over, and they were expecting this flight when it came, so they were ready.
Yeah.
And it wasn't the surface-to-air missiles that brought down the U-2 flight were not the first ones that actually went up.
Yeah. So the U-2 is a very, very simple aircraft, but it's also very challenging to shoot down because it flies so high. So it has a very large wing surface area. It's very light, and it has 2 very small engines. It's essentially a flying fuel tank. So and it doesn't maneuver at all. It almost looks and flies like a glider very slowly. And so fighter jets have tremendous problem going against this aircraft because they're using up a lot of fuel to try to get up to it. And in the high altitudes that this aircraft is operating, it's using absolutely minimal fuel. So by the time they boost and by the time they get up to it, it's too late. They're already running out of fuel and they're already coming down. So the missiles didn't have this disadvantage. The missiles were larger, actually, than the U-2, and they were absolutely full of fuel. And they could maneuver while the U-2 couldn't, which is why the U-2 was shot down. And another U-2 was shot down later.
Which we will talk about. For sure. But of course, this allowed the Soviets to have that just fantastically dramatic moment where Khrushchev unveiled the spy equipment. This wasn't a weather plane. This was obviously a spy plane. And now the Soviet Union had a U-2 that they could, what's it called when you go backwards? Exploit, but they wanted
technologically
to make
exploit. They could reverse engineer a lot of the pieces, but when they started taking the U-2 apart and looking at it, they had all the pieces already.
And they did actually have a program or create a program to make their own U-2, but they ended up not doing it.
Yeah.
And as we saw just a few years ago, it's easier if you want to take pictures of America to, I guess, just send a balloon.
Yeah.
Right? Nobody wants to shoot that down a plane. A U-2 might get shot down. This did cause the end of the U-2 program over the Soviet Union. But we weren't only using the U-2 at the time over the Soviet Union. We were also using it over the Middle East quite frequently, actually. That's how we discovered what was going on in the Negev desert as Israel was developing or not developing the bomb they may or may not have.
And it was used. It was used over Cuba to discover the communist government there setting up missile sites for the
Yes.
Soviets to use.
And that is the final U-2 shoot down during hostilities, which happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that was an American major who was shot down in 1962.
Mhm.
But it turns out the U-2 actually wasn't a great use of money when you have satellites.
Mhm.
So it began to be phased out about that time after the
Cuban
Missile Crisis,
the
right?
U-2 was actually used for a really long time afterwards, well into the 21st century.
Oh, okay.
So the reason it's difficult to turn satellites, and it's almost impossible to move satellites from their orbits. So the U-2 was used kind of in a more tactical sense, where if you needed to have a picture of something tomorrow, a U-2 could take a picture of it. But it was much more complicated to do with a satellite. The other advantage was the U-2 could take much higher resolution footage, film, and that's just because it was much lower than the satellites were. But some of the cameras were held in common.
It's not like that scene in Real Genius with one of my favorite Val Kilmer movies where they have the satellite and it takes the picture all the way down.
So some of that is true, but that's just more complicated.
Okay.
And the satellites are much more expensive. The U-2 just basically costs the fuel and the salary of the pilot, which is
okay, but paid. Real Genius, definite.
Yes.
You should watch.
Yeah.
So it is now time to see things
as they are not.
As they are not. I'm just going to add a little bit more to my coffee that's left. Some good stuff.
So
how was the second taste?
Excellent. I'm using Teeling's glasses.
Did we get those at the distillery?
Oh, we did.
We did? Okay.
And this is just as a little bit of a middle finger to traditional whiskey culture.
Why would you middle finger traditional whiskey culture?
Because I'm a rebel.
Yeah, a rebel. A rebel Dottie. A loner.
I am.
Who loves cats. Mm-hmm. And the cat cannot stay out of the camera. The cat loves cameras too.
She does.
So, drink number 2, we're now coming into our lifetime. So things that we saw unfold as we were growing up, although we were still kids during both of these. They were both extremely big deals. And the first one we'll talk about is the 1983 shoot down of the Korean Airlines flight 007, which is a great number. It's too bad they had to retire.
Yeah, they did retire.
Well, I would hope so, because I would not take that flight.
Anytime a flight crashes or is shot down, they retire the number.
So Korean Airlines flight left out of Alaska and almost immediately started going off course. And this was a particularly fraught time, 1983, in the history of Cold War relations. Ronald Reagan was in office in the U.S., and there was a succession of increasingly older leaders of the Soviet Union and calcification, I would say, going on there. And so on top of all of this rhetoric, Star Wars, the system Star Wars was being talked about. I don't remember.
The Strategic Defense Initiative.
Thank you. So kind of actually that's kind of what Israel has with the Iron Dome, right?
It does, yes.
Okay, so kind of the same,
yeah.
But it's supposed to come from space, so maybe not.
So it was a space-based interceptor system for ballistic missiles.
Okay.
So the idea was that you would use a laser to heat a missile until it went off course, until it exploded, or until it was rendered unusable. So when it landed,
okay, so not like Iron Dome.
So not like Iron Dome. Iron Dome is from the ground. The theory is the same, but the direction is different.
All right.
So one comes from above, one comes from below.
So not only was Star Wars being talked about and Reagan was using increasingly loud rhetoric in certain instances, but the U.S. had just held this massive naval exercise in the Pacific. It was the biggest naval exercise that had ever been held at that time. And right then, at that moment, as that flight was going, there were also missile tests being conducted by the Soviet Union, and so this airspace was completely off limits and was being buzzed by NATO. Well, it wasn't NATO, it was US.
It was U.S. aircraft, yeah.
But I believe there were a few others involved too. Spy flights.
Yeah.
I don't remember exactly. Anyway, there were spy flights buzzing this missile test. So going off course, as the Korean Airlines flight did, was catastrophic. And it was going to be catastrophic as soon as it happened. There was no way around this. The Soviet Union was already on edge. They were convinced at that time that they thought Reagan wanted to start a nuclear war. They were old and didn't want to fight a nuclear war, but they, of course, couldn't just roll over and let things happen. Mm-hmm. And they were testing a missile, and this plane was coming into their airspace just as other spy planes were coming into their airspace. And disaster happened.
So one of the important things is to note about air defense systems is these are the most complicated and most expensive systems that any government, any military has. And so the operators of these systems should be the most professional, should be the smartest, the most educated, and should be the most highly trained. But quite often...
That was not the case in this instance.
That was not the case in this instance.
That was absolutely not the case in this instance. There had been a huge storm, a windstorm, that had taken out the radar capability of the Soviet Union in certain, what are they called, forward deployed areas?
Just early warning radar.
Okay, so their early warning radar had been taken out by storms. And in true Soviet bureaucratic fashion, the people operating it lied and said, no, it's fixed. It's fine. It's fixed. It's all good. So they weren't there. They couldn't tell what the signature, right? That's what it's called. The signature of the plane was. They actually really didn't know that it was a civilian flight. They absolutely didn't know. So the plane went in, went out, went back in. And when it went back in, the Sov said, take it out. You must take it out before it reaches international waters. But that didn't work because it was likely that the Sovs didn't hit it until it was in international waters. And again, there was no attempt at a radio contact.
But this is a portion of this is the U-2 problem as well, which is that the interceptors ran out of gas, possibly because of incompetence, but definitely because of the fact that they wasted so much fuel getting up to altitude that they didn't have a chance to do anything after they were there.
So nobody else could ping the radio?
Yeah, it also depends on what radio channels people were listening to. And it depends on the skill of the operators in interpreting what they're saying. So English, no matter where you are in the world, is the language of international travel.
Which comes into play in our next.
Yeah. So this includes Iranian flights that are traveling to Dubai. It includes Russian flights that are traveling to Bulgaria. It includes British flights that are traveling to France and French flights that are traveling to the Netherlands.
It's also the reason why a certain Polish flight over Russian territory went down in 2010.
Yeah.
But that's not within our time frame.
So English is a required language for pilots and air traffic controllers to speak. But English is not a required skill for missile operators to speak. And some pilots aren't actually very good in English from some of these countries. And so there could have been a communication problem as well.
They did shoot in front of the plane, but it was dark. So the plane couldn't see. The pilot had no idea what was going on. What really hurt my soul reading about this, one of the particularly awful things was it was likely that when this Korean Airlines flight was hit, they didn't die immediately. They probably were conscious until they hit the water.
Yeah, and there was a congressman killed in this.
There was a U.S. congressman killed, and he was a Democrat, and he was actually a conservative Democrat. So it actually did create some issues within politics as well. Mm-hmm. Then the flight went down when I'm going to say rescuers, but there was nobody to rescue. Search and rescue came for the plane. The Soviet Union then was harassing them completely and not following the international rules, because they didn't want it to be known if the flight had been hit over international waters, which it likely was.
Yeah. So this is another aspect of the fact that people try to avoid responsibility. People are overly bureaucratic, and there's an active within the Soviet Union in their intelligence agencies and their military. There was an active effort at the time, and still today, to hamper investigations, just to make them more challenging, and just if something negative comes out, just to be able to say, hey, the investigation was bad. Never mind that it was bad because they damaged it.
Yeah, that was their fault.
It was their fault, but the investigation was still bad.
Right. And so this one, they did end up paying restitution, as the Bulgarians did in 1955, but no one has. It's there's still a lot of open questions about this flight. One thing that did come out of this flight being shot down, however, that has completely changed the world, is that this was the impetus for Ronald Reagan to make GPS available to everyone. So we have, well, Apple Maps, Google Maps, whatever you're using to drive, Waze. Well, I don't want to say thanks to this shoot down because that sounds terrible. I don't.
But it's a result of.
It's a result.
The civilian use of what was previously military GPS.
Yes.
And this has led to a wide variety of additional benefits and a lot of negatives that have to do with GPS. So this was kind of a watershed event in history.
It was absolutely a watershed event in history. So, fourth and final event that we will be talking about happened in 1988, and it was Iran Air Flight 655. And I'm going to let you do that one first because you've studied this a lot more than I have.
So this was toward the end of the Iran-Iraq War, although you don't know you're in the end of the war until after the war is over.
Of course not, yeah.
So I'm sure to the Iranians and to the Iraqis, it seemed like they were just in the middle of the war. This was an area where the Vincennes
and Straits of Hormuz.
Yes, in the Straits of Hormuz, this is an area where the Vincennes ended up firing a couple of missiles and shooting down an Iranian airliner. So the background to this, and this was on the 3rd of July, 1988. So the background to this was the Straits to some degree were mined, an oil tanker was hit. There was severe Iranian aggression going on all up and down the Straits.
The previous year, actually, the Iraqis had hit an American ship. So everybody's on edge.
Everybody's on edge.
And we're there because 20% of the world's oil was transiting this one place. We had just come out of the 1970s, which, if you lived during that time, you remember waiting in the car to fill with gas at the gas. I remember this. And you're just kind of hoping there's going to be gas when they get there. There were real problems. So letting the oil supply be interrupted was just not going to happen at that point. So we had American ships there in the Strait.
Yeah, American warships in the Straits escorting some of these ships with some degree of success and some degree of failure. So in order to try to ameliorate some of these issues with the confusion in crowded airspace, the U.S. issued a NOTAM, which is a notice to airmen, to monitor international distress frequencies. And these were the frequencies that air defense and air-to-air aircraft were also supposed to monitor at the same time. So that in theory, they would be able to communicate with each other and avoid complications like the shoot down. And the airliner took off late, but it was still transmitting properly and in English, as we discussed. The transmissions were sometimes marginal, but this one was in English. And the air defense troops on board the ship just they weren't trained on how to look at civilian aircraft tables. The flight was late.
They'd never been in a combat situation.
They'd never been in a combat situation before. These were green crews.
Right.
And there's an element of the fact that the Iranians and Iraqis were all attacking up and down the strait as well. And so they simply misidentified the aircraft.
Yes. Well, and that is what is the official.
Yeah. And the final nail in the coffin of the aircraft, unfortunately, was that it originated from Bandar Abbas, which is a mixed-use military and civilian airfield, but it was the
Right.
main airfield that the Iranians were using to launch their attacks.
Yeah,
So
it was headed to Dubai.
yeah, so it was headed to Dubai, and it flew right over the Vincennes. And so the U.S. air defenders saw this aircraft. They misidentified it either as a fighter or a bomber, most likely a bomber because of its size and its flight profile. Thought, okay, maybe we're under attack, and so we're going to shoot this thing down.
Right. And there was an issue also with the new software. They had new software to do this, and it was reusing flight identifications. So there was a fighter that took off in the same time frame as this flight, and there may have been a mix up between the two. In the end, it doesn't matter because a bunch of civilians were killed.
Yeah.
And which is awful. This is, it's something that you never want to happen, whether it's a Korean Airlines flight or an Iran Air flight or El Al. Just this should not be something that's happening, and it happened. And to this day, it is still something that is very hotly debated. There are a lot of known knowns and known unknowns, to mangle Rumsfeld's quote. It was just a few months later. There was so much horror that it was just a few months later that the Iran-Iraq war ended. Mm-hmm. And I think this actually might have contributed to that. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that if they were planning, the war ended in a not nice way, right?
It ended in a stalemate.
Yeah, nobody won. Nobody came out on top. This was not a good way for it to end. It was certainly not how Iran would have wanted it to end, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't think that they would have done that deliberately just to end the war ignominiously a few months later.
I don't think they did it to end the war ignominiously, but I think they did that in order to try to, or this is the general thinking, in order to show, hey, the U.S. is aggressive and that the U.S. should be forced to withdraw its warships out of the Straits. That's not what happened. And notably, Iran didn't start the war. Saddam Hussein started the war after the Iranian Revolution. And so the Iranians were actually probably pretty happy to end the war in the end because it caused tremendous devastation.
It did cause tremendous devastation. I think you can be happy to end the war, a war that's going nowhere, without getting 200 and some odd people killed to make a point that wasn't made. There was one further coda to this story, however. So this happened in July, and then in August, the war was ended. And then in December, which I hate this because it's actually on our wedding anniversary. Mm-hmm. So on December 21st, Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland was shot down. And because...
Well, it was blown up.
Wasn't blown down. Blown up, yes. Yeah. Sorry. Blown up. And this was maybe the second airline disaster heard around the world. If the first was the U-2 getting taken down. And so after the shoot down of Iran Air, the Charge d'Affaires in London, the Iranian CDA, came out and said, oh, we'll have our revenge, right? So of course, when you have an airline shot down over Scotland, everybody's like, okay, mm-hmm. Iran, we would like to have a talk about this. And it immediately put them in the crosshairs, although we found out later.
It was a totally different Islamic terrorist state, not Iran.
Yeah, it was from Libya.
It was from Libya.
So that was kind of the coda to this whole 1988 air disasters year. Mm-hmm. So with that, I think it's time to see things as they really are. All right.
So I've got to say, Indian whiskeys have come a long way. The uniquely moist air in India, where the whiskeys, it's very moist air, but the very moist air causes a slightly faster maturation process inside the whiskey barrels, and so you get a little bit more maturity than you would in some of the whiskeys that are matured in drier climates.
So I have to say that adding this Bailey's toffee popcorn to my coffee makes me want to watch Hallmark movies, Hallmark Christmas movies. I think this is, you're going to need more whiskey.
I think I need a few more whiskeys.
You're going to need a few more whiskey. So, final thoughts. Would you like to start?
I think the final thoughts are that air travel is inherently dangerous, especially when you're flying over people who like to shoot missiles to make points.
As the MH flight.
But we don't discuss that.
Oh yeah, nope. It's too soon.
It's too soon.
It's too soon. History hasn't been. We haven't figured out history there, and I would agree with you. It's amazing how few accidents we actually have, given how much goes on and how many airplanes are in the sky.
Yeah,
absolutely insane. How safe something that seems so inherently unsafe is. And yet,
hurling through the air in a metal tube.
Here we are in a metal tube, crowded up with a bunch of other people, sitting on, as George Carlin called it, a pillow of beer farts.
With your luggage left at the airport.
With your luggage left at the airport. Our luggage has been left at quite a few airports.
Indeed it has.
Yeah, it has. It usually gets home. I think we've only lost one or two.
Yeah.
In traveling. So.
To the final glass.
To the final glass. We gonna cheers?
What to do